There is a kind of invisibility that only happens inside families, not the invisibility of a stranger passing through a crowd. Anonymous and unbothered, free in the way that unseen people are sometimes free. This is a different kind entirely. This is the invisibility of being present, fully, physically, undeniably present, in a room full of people who share your blood and your last name and the particular cadence of a laugh that runs through your lineage like a thread, and being looked through anyway, being spoken around, being the person that the room's attention slides off of, naturally, without effort, the way water slides off of something it has never been asked to soak into. I grew up in that invisibility. I became an expert at its texture, its specific weight, the way it felt different on a Tuesday than it felt at Christmas, heavier in summer when the whole family gathered and the not seeing became a group activity, lighter in the long stretches of ordinary time when it was just me and my mother in the quiet of a house that had learned to exist without requiring anything from anyone who wasn't there. My father was not there, not in the way that counts. This is that story, and I need you to stay with me through all of it, through the long middle of it especially, through the part that isn't dramatic or cinematic, the part that is just a person living inside a particular kind of hurt and learning, slowly, how to carry it without letting it become them, because the ending only means something if you understand the weight of everything that came before it. And the ending is worth understanding. Let me build this from the ground. My parents were never married. This was not in itself the wound. Plenty of people have parents who were never married and grow up entirely whole, loved completely by both, lacking nothing that a legal document could have provided. The wound was not the absence of a ceremony. The wound was the absence of a choice. My father, whose name is Carlton, made a decision when I was approximately 3 months old. A quiet, private, never formally announced decision that his life was going to proceed in a particular direction, and that direction did not have a meaningful place in it for me. He was not cruel about it. I want to be precise because precision matters here, and because I spent a long time needing to be precise about this before I could see it clearly. Carlton was never cruel. He never said anything terrible to me. He never showed up and delivered some devastating speech about not wanting me or about my mother or about the circumstances of my birth. What he did was something more mundane and more damaging. He was simply, consistently, masterfully less present than he said he'd be. Less interested than a father should be. Less engaged, less curious, less invested, always just enough below the threshold of active neglect that he could tell himself he was doing the basic minimum and therefore wasn't really doing anything wrong. He had another family. This I knew from the time I was old enough to understand what families were and how they were composed. A wife named Renata, 2 sons, Darius and Marcus, 3 and 5 years older than me respectively, a house in a suburb I had visited exactly twice, a life with a shape and a center that I was adjacent to but never inside of. Carlton showed up at my mother's apartment on birthdays sometimes. Not every birthday. The ones where the math worked out, conveniently for him, where the gap between his absence and the occasion had grown conspicuous enough that he felt the social pressure of correction. He would arrive with something that was almost a gift and stay for something that was almost a visit and leave in the way that people leave places where they never fully arrived. My mother, whose name is Diane and who is the reason I am whoever I am, never spoke badly of him in front of me. Not once. This was an act of extraordinary and continuous discipline that I did not fully appreciate until I was old enough to understand what it cost her. She simply raised me fiercely, practically, with the particular competence of a woman who has decided that the absence of help is not an acceptable reason for the absence of outcome. She worked. She saved. She showed up at every school event, every game, every performance, always in the 3rd row because she said the 3rd row gave you the best angle, and I believed her for years before. I understood she'd simply internalized that the 3rd row was the one she could always get to without rushing from work. I was not an unhappy child. This is important. I don't want you to construct a portrait of misery, because that's not accurate, and accuracy matters here. I had my mother, which was substantial. I had a small group of friends, a talent for building things and models, later furniture, later still the structural logic of complex projects, and a kind of self-contained quality that my teacher sometimes noted and that I now understand was the natural development of a child who had learned early that depending on people who were unreliable was a form of self-harm. I was not unhappy. I was just quietly, permanently aware of a shape in my life where something should have been and wasn't. Carlton's family, his other family, the one with the house in the center, held a reunion every 3 years. A significant event by the accounts I received secondhand and then, eventually firsthand, his wife's family combined with his own extended relatives. A full weekend at a rented property. The kind of gathering that generates photographs that end up in frames and stories that get repeated until they become mythology. I had been invited to exactly none of them. This was not an oversight. This was a configuration. When I was 27, something changed. I don't know exactly what prompted it. My mother suggested, with her characteristic measured fairness, that perhaps Carlton was aging into a different kind of reckoning. That men sometimes did that. That it didn't excuse anything, but it might explain the shift. Whatever the reason, I received a phone call from Carlton in February of that year, and he told me that the reunion was happening in July, and that he would like me to come. I sat with that invitation for 3 weeks before I responded. What I was sitting with was not whether I wanted to go. I knew I wanted to go, not out of hope. Exactly, not out of the child's hunger for a father's acknowledgement that I had spent considerable effort growing past, but out of something more like the desire to finally be in the room, to exist physically and undeniably, in the space where his two lives had always been kept separate, to see with my own eyes and in real time what I had been excluded from, and to know myself well enough to handle what I found there. I told Carlton I would come. I told my mother, who said, "Be careful with your heart, baby." I told no one else because there was nothing yet to tell. The reunion was held at a lakeside property rented for the weekend. I arrived on the Saturday morning, the second day, having driven 3 hours and stopped once for coffee I didn't drink and a conversation with myself, in a gas station parking lot that I would not repeat here, but that was necessary, and that I do not regret. I had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to arrive. There is a difference. I wanted to take up appropriate space. I wanted to be undeniable in a purely physical presentational sense, because I understood that in rooms where you have been invisible, the first act of visibility is simply being seen. Carlton met me in the parking area. He was 61. He had aged into a version of himself that was somehow both exactly what I expected and completely unfamiliar. I had constructed him so thoroughly from limited material over so many years that the reality of him, three-dimensional and gray-templed and slightly less tall than I remembered, was disorienting in the specific way that real things are always disorienting when you have been living with their imagined versions for too long. He shook my hand. He shook my hand, the way you shake the hand of someone you have just been introduced to, and said he was glad I came. I said thank you for inviting me. We walked into the gathering together, and I felt the exact moment the room noticed us, a brief collective recalibration, heads turning, conversations pausing, the particular social machinery of a family group processing new information and deciding what to do with it. Darius and Marcus were there. I had not met them formally before. I had seen photographs, had constructed them the way I had constructed Carlton, from limited material over long distance. Darius was 32 and looked like Carlton in a way I found unexpectedly difficult to process. Marcus was 30, was warmer in his initial greeting, a handshake that became a brief, slightly awkward, almost hug. And I appreciated the effort even as I noted that neither of them seemed to have been told much about me, which told me something about what Carlton had said about me in my absence, which was probably close to nothing. Renata was gracious. This surprised me, and I had to work not to let the surprise show. Because I had no right to be surprised. I had constructed her too, from the child's need to assign blame somewhere tangible, and the reality of her was a person who had been navigating a complicated marriage for 30 years and who greeted me with a dignity that I respected immediately. And then the day proceeded. "This is the part I need you to sit inside with me," Because this is where the real story is. The day proceeded and Carlton ignored me. Not completely. Not aggressively. With that same practiced masterful lessness that had defined my entire childhood, always. Just enough engagement to maintain plausible deniability, never enough to constitute actual presence. He moved through the reunion like a man at home, which he was, and I moved through it like a man learning the layout of a place he had always been told he didn't belong in, which I was. He introduced me to people when proximity made not introducing me socially awkward, and in those introductions I was my son without any further context, without any acknowledgement of the distance or the years, or the particular weight of the occasion. Just my son, the way you say my colleague or my neighbor. Accurate, informative, and completely devoid of anything that resembled feeling. By 3 in the afternoon, I was sitting near the water by myself, watching the lake, having a quiet conversation with myself about why I had come and what I had expected, and whether those two things had been honest with each other. And I arrived at something sitting there that I want to try to give you accurately because it matters. I arrived at the understanding that I had not come for Carlton. I had told myself I had. I had constructed a story in which this weekend was about finally being acknowledged by my father, finally being seen, finally having the invisible thing become visible. But sitting at the edge of that lake at 3 in the afternoon, watching the light on the water and feeling the specific texture of being in a room full of family and being alone anyway, I understood that what I had actually come for was something else entirely. I had come to finish something, to close a loop that had been open for 27 years, to be in the room not because the room owed me anything but because I owed it to myself, to stop letting the room be a myth. I had come to stop being afraid of what I'd find here. And now I had found it. It was ordinary. It was painful. It was not, in the end, any worse than what I had already lived. And that meant I was going to be okay. I drove home Sunday morning. I did not have a confrontation. I did not make a speech. I said goodbye to Carlton with the same handshake he'd greeted me with, and to Darius and Marcus with something that felt like the beginning of a thing that might one day become something, and to Renata with genuine respect. And I drove 3 hours home and called my mother and told her I was okay and meant it. What happened 4 months later I did not see coming. Carlton's father, my grandfather, a man named Elias, whom I had met perhaps 4 times in my life, and who had nonetheless sent me a card on my high school graduation that I still have, a simple card that said, "I see you," boy in his careful old man handwriting. Elias died in November at the age of 89, peacefully at home, which was what he had wanted. I was notified of the funeral by Carlton via text, which was itself a statement. I attended. I sat in the back because I did not know where else to sit, and because something in me was still, after everything, unwilling to take up space I hadn't been clearly given. I watched my grandfather's casket and thought about that card, about "I see you, boy," and felt a grief that was layered in the complicated way that grief for someone you barely knew but somehow still loved is always layered. 3 weeks after the funeral, I received a call from an attorney's office. A paralegal asked me to confirm my full name and address. She told me there was a reading of Elias's estate to which I had been named, and asked me to attend on the following Thursday. I told no one. I drove to that attorney's office alone, the way I had driven to most significant things in my life, and I sat in a waiting room and felt the particular quality of not knowing what was coming and having learned, from long practice, to simply wait. Carlton was in the room. So were Darius and Marcus. So were 2 of Elias's other children, my aunts whom I barely knew. And when the attorney read the document and reached my name, and read the amount that Elias had set aside for me specifically, not as part of a shared distribution but as a named specific, individual bequest with a note attached that the attorney read in the room, in front of everyone, a note that said, "To my grandson, who came from a part of my son's life that my son did not always honor, I see you. I always did. This is for the time that was lost." When all of that happened, in that room in front of Carlton and his sons and his sisters, I did not feel triumph. I felt something much quieter than triumph. I felt witnessed by a man who was no longer living, through a document he had prepared with full knowledge of what it would mean in that room. On that day, in front of those people, my grandfather had looked at the shape of my life from whatever vantage point he'd had, and he had decided, and quietly, privately, with the power that very old men sometimes discover when they reckon with what they have and haven't done, to correct something. Carlton's face in that room was the most complex thing I have ever watched a human face do. Shame and surprise and something I can only call recognition, the look of a man who is seeing for the first time his own behavior reflected back at him through another person's judgment of it, his father's judgment, the judgment of the person whose opinion, I realized watching him, had always mattered to him more than anyone's. He called me that evening, I answered. He did not explain himself. There was no explanation adequate to the architecture of 27 years, and I think he knew that. What he said was, "My father saw something in you that I should have spent more time seeing. I don't know how to make that right, but I'd like to try if you'll allow it." I told him I would think about it. I told him that thinking about it was, given everything, already more than he might reasonably have expected. He said he understood. I believed that he did. My grandfather's bequest changed my material circumstances in ways I had not anticipated and will not detail here because that's not the point. The point is what it represented, not the money but the deliberate, documented, publicly witnessed act of a man refusing to let his grandson's invisibility stand uncorrected. Elias could not undo what Carlton had done. He could not give me back the reunions or the birthdays or the shape in my life where a father should have been, but he could stand in a room, even in his absence, and say, "I see you," and he did. I think about him on the mornings when the light is right, and I am building something with my hands, the way I always have, the way that has always been how I process the world. I think about a card in my mother's handwriting that said, "I see you," when I think about what it means to be seen, not perfectly, not completely, not by everyone, but by enough. By the right ones. By the people who bothered to look. Here is what I want to leave with you. You do not need everyone in the room to see you. You need to see yourself, clearly, honestly, without the distortion of other people's failure to look. The people who overlooked you are not the authority on your value. They are just people who didn't look carefully enough. And sometimes, in ways and from directions you could never have predicted, someone who was watching all along will stand up and say so. If you have ever sat at the edge of something, a room, a relationship, a family, and felt the specific ache of being present and unseen, I want you to leave one word in the comments right now. Elias. Just that. You'll know why, and I'll know you were here. Subscribe because this community is built for the ones who are in the back row. Turn on notifications, because the next story is already written, and it will reach the part of you that has been waiting, quietly and without making a fuss, to finally be found. I'll see you there.